In today's video, we're going to look at how you can get started with the new WebAii testing framework from Telerik, powered by Art of Test, showing you how you can begin the process of creating powerful integration tests for your Silverlight and your ASP.NET Ajax applications. First of all, WebAii testing framework, a few facts you should know. This is a free automated integration testing framework that ships with the RAD controls for ASP.NET Ajax and the RAD controls for Silverlight. It's based on the WebAii testing framework version 2.0, which is currently in beta. And that framework enables us to provide the support for both ASP.NET websites and Silverlight websites. And one of the unique differences when it comes to using the WebAii testing framework from Telerik is that it installs by default with the configured RAD control translators. And these are translators that abstract away the implementation of the RAD controls for both Silverlight and ASP.NET Ajax, so your tests do not need to care about the control implementation and can instead focus on the control behavior. So today we're going to spend our time in Visual Studio 2008, and we're going to look at how we can use the WebAii testing framework to create a simple automated integration test or automated web UI test for a Silverlight project. The approach would be very much the same if you're doing testing for ASP.NET Ajax, but since Silverlight testing is new, we'll focus on that today. The basic premise when using WebAii testing framework is that you'll have an application and you'll need to add a new class library to your project and then handwrite your tests. Now, the handwriting of tests is something that is unique to the free version, the WebAii testing framework. If you would like to use an automated recorder to create your tests, so you don't have to write the code, the Web UI Test Studio from Telerik enables you to do that, which is built on top of the same WebAii testing framework. So what you have here then in front of you in Visual Studio 2008 is a simple Silverlight 2 project, and in my Silverlight 2 project, on the default page.xaml that's been created, I've added a Telerik RAD menu for Silverlight. You can see my RAD menu has been given the name of Menu 1, and I've added a few menu items to it, a File menu item, an Open menu item as a sub-item to File, and an Edit item. Also in my Solution Explorer, you'll notice the default WebAii Silverlight.web project, or the web project Visual Studio will create for me automatically when I create a new Silverlight project, and I've done nothing special to configure that. It's just the default files created by Visual Studio. So if I run my Silverlight project now to give you some context of what it looks like in the browser, I'll hit Control F5. This will load my project in the browser. And we should see my very simple Silverlight application load, which simply has our RAD menu for Silverlight. And there's our RAD menu. We see the Edit option, and we see if we click on File, we have the Open option as well. So that's our application, and that's what we want to create an integration test or an automated web UI test for. So back in Visual Studio, to begin creating our automated UI tests, to my solution, I'm going to add a new class library. So I'm going to select Add New Project from the right-click menu. And I'm going to add a new C# class library. And we'll just go ahead and call this WebAii Tests. And we'll click OK. This C# class library will be added to our project, and within this project we can then begin creating our automated tests. To do that, we need to have a number of references added to our project, and for today's testing purposes we'll create our tests using NUnit. You can use many different unit testing frameworks to create your automated tests, such as Microsoft Test, but NUnit is a very popular open source testing framework, so we'll use that today. Go ahead and delete the class that's created by default. And then within my WebAii test project, I'm going to select to add a new item. And within the new item template selector, you'll see that when you've installed the WebAii testing framework, you'll have a new template option. If I go to the test section and expand that, you'll see WebAii 2.0. And then you'll see a number of templates for the different testing frameworks that are available and supported by default with the WebAii testing framework. And from here, I'm going to select NUnit, and we'll go ahead and leave the standard name. So we'll create a WebAii NUnit Test 1 and click Add. The advantage of using the template is twofold. First of all, it's going to provide some default code we can work from within our project to save us time creating our unit test, or our automated integration unit test in this case. And it's also going to add all the necessary references for working with the WebAii test to my project, which we can see in my references section has already added artoftest.common and artoftest.webAii. Now, since I'm going to be working with NUnit, I need to also add my NUnit references. When you can see, I've created a solution folder here with my NUnit assemblies. So I can quickly add references to my NUnit assemblies as well. I'll select Add Reference. And we'll just browse to that folder. So I'll go up and look for binaries, and then I'll just simply add my NUnit references. So now that I've got my NUnit references in there as well, I should be able to start customizing my test to create my complete integration test. Before we do that, let's examine the code that's been added for us by default. You can see that, first of all, our test uses the standard NUnit test fixture and NUnit test syntax, or attribute markup, method attributes. You can also see that we inherit from the base test class, and this base class is provided by the WebAii testing framework. Within the setup and teardown methods for my test, we also find some default code with a number of comments explaining what the code is doing. And we see that one of the first things done, or the only thing really done in the initialize of the setup, or the setup of my test, is an initialization method. And by default, this is expecting to work with a standard ASP.NET Ajax website, but we can customize our initialize method to work with Silverlight by uncommenting one of the sections that's created by default here below. So I'm going to uncomment this section. And when I uncomment this section, what I'm going to do is, instead of calling the above initialize, I'm going to set some settings and then call my initialize method. So let me close this off, delete this. Here we can see the settings object, and we're getting a reference to the settings that are already in existence, the default settings. And instead of changing the default browser as the code sample does here, let's go ahead and say settings.enable Silverlight, since we're doing Silverlight testing, and set that equal to true. Our project in our unit test can now work with the automated Silverlight testing, and now we pass those settings into our initialize method, and our project can initialize properly for testing Silverlight applications. In our cleanup, or our test teardown, you can see that we simply call a cleanup method, and that cleans up everything that we've created to work with our automated test. So let's actually look at creating a test. Now there's a standard simple test provided by default that does a very basic test of google.com, but we really don't want to work with that. We prefer to create our own test method. So let's just go ahead and delete this and start from scratch. So I'm going to start by creating a new test method, and let's just go ahead and call this public void ensure. Well, testing method names is something of an art. You can pick any approach that you prefer. So let's just be descriptive. We want to say rad menu expands when clicked. So that's explaining exactly what this test is going to test for. And then we can start writing the body of our test method. So what do we want to do when we test that the rad menu expands when clicked? Well, basically we need to do a number of things. We need to open the browser, navigate to the page that has our rad menu, and then go about actually using the rad control translators for the WebAii testing framework to execute a click event and validate that our menu is expanded. So the first step then is to launch the browser. We can do that by using the static manager, and then we have a launch browser method. And the launch browser method accepts the type of browser to launch. And there are a number of browser types available. So if I use the enumeration, you can see that you can either pick Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari. Future versions will also support browsers like Chrome. But for today, let's just go ahead and pick Internet Explorer. Well, now that we've launched our Internet browser, the next step is to navigate the browser to the page we want to test. So we can say active browser. Then we, from this, call navigate to, and pass in the address to navigate to the page we want to test. Now there are a number of more advanced ways you can specify the navigate to address that are dynamically adjusted for your project. And if you look at the example tests installed with the WebAii testing framework, you can see an approach that is much more dynamic. For today, we'll just use a simple string so that we can keep our example simple. And I'll just copy and paste in the location to our page that contains our Silverlight application. WebAii Silverlight test page, the test page created by Visual Studio. So now that we've navigated to the correct page, the next thing we need to do is get a reference to our Silverlight application on that page. And we can do that very conveniently by using a built-in reference to all Silverlight applications on a page navigated to that WebAii testing framework exposes. So say var slapp, just a variable to hold our Silverlight app. And then we'll once again use active browser. And you'll notice that the active browser has a property called Silverlight apps. And Silverlight apps is an extension method, actually, that returns all Silverlight apps on the page. And we can specifically get a reference to the app we're looking for by either passing in its index, which is a zero-based index for all Silverlight apps on the page, or we can pass in a string that represents the ID of the HTML element hosting the Silverlight app on the page. So let's just go ahead and pass in 0. Since there's only one app on our page, we'll know that'll be the first one. Now that we have a reference to our Silverlight application, the next step is to get a reference to our menu in the application. And that's also very easy with WebAii testing framework. We'll just create another variable of our menu. And then from our Silverlight application, so slapp, you'll find a very convenient method called findName. And there's actually a find name T, which allows us to specify the type of the object we're looking for. In this case, a rad menu. So we can say rad menu, and then we're going to need to provide an import or an using statement to actually use this. So we'll come back and add that in just a moment. But then once we specify the type, we need to specify the ID for the control. And you recall when we looked at page.xaml, the ID for our menu is menu1. So we'll simply type menu1 here, and that should enable us to find our menu control in our application. Now, in order to work with the rad controls, of course, in our testing, we do need a reference to the rad controls assemblies as well. So I'm going to come back over to my references, and we will add an additional reference to our telerik.windows.controls. And we also, we don't need telerik.windows.controls. What we really need is the telerik.webAI.controls.xaml.dll, and this is actually the translators assembly that contains all the necessary information for testing the various rad controls, in this case for Silverlight. So I'm going to select that, click OK. That'll add the reference to my project, and that should enable me to now quickly add the using statement to my page, or in this case to my class. So now that we have a reference to the menu, the next thing we need to do then is just actually begin our testing of the menu's behavior. So let's get a reference to the first menu item in our menu, in this case the file item. So we'll say var file menu equals menu.items. And we know that it's the first item in the menu. We could, of course, access this in different ways, but we know the file menu item is the first item in our menu, so we'll get a reference to it that way. And now let's start by asserting, just as you would in any other unit test, that the menu item is closed, or its expand menu is closed when the page loads, or in this case our Silverlight application loads. So we'll say Silverlight, or assert, dot is false, and then the condition we want to check for is that file item, the file menu item we just got a reference to, so file menu dot is pop-up open. You see we have a convenient property for testing whether or not its pop-up menu is open. And we want to make sure that it's not open, so we should have it assert that it is false by default. And we could, of course, provide a message here if we want to be more descriptive, and we should typically to make our unit tests easier to decipher. But really all we need to do is verify that it is false that our pop-up is open. That's the way it should be when the Silverlight application loads. Next, we need to execute a behavior. We need to actually simulate the menu being open. So we can then do file menu dot, and there are a number of things you could do here, but one thing you can do is click. And this will actually simulate a click on our file menu item. Once it's been clicked, the pop-up menu should then be expanded, so we can then come back and assert at this point is true that our file menu dot is pop-up open. So once it's clicked, it should be open. And this circular test then verifies completely that our application is performing as we expect it to in the browser, or our UI is executing, behaving as we expect it to in the browser. We can then save this, and then we can simply execute our NUnit test as we would any other test, and we will have an integration test of our UI. To do that today, I'm going to right-click on my method, and using test-driven, simply select Run Tests. This will build our tests and build our projects, and then we should see the test begin executing. In this case, it's going to open our application in the browser, as you can see here. It navigates to the page we told it to navigate to, loads our application, and then it begins executing exactly what we told it to do. In that case, a click on our menu item. When it completes, it closes our test, or closes our browser. If we only have one test, it'll close the browser, and we can specify in our settings whether we want multiple tests to reuse the same browser window. And when we come back to Visual Studio, we see that one test passed and 0 failed, and that everything looks good. Our our application is performing exactly as we expect it to. And that's the exact approach you would take, only in a more complicated form as you have more complicated UIs, to adding more and more test steps and checks, to building out automated web UI tests for Silverlight applications using the free WebAI testing framework for Telerik. Hopefully this quick introduction to how you get started working with the free WebAI testing framework from Telerik, powered by Art of Test, shows you how easy it is to start adding automated integration tests to your projects and improving the quality of your testing today.